Originally developed in 1991 by Toejam and Earl Productions and published by Sega for the Mega Drive, was that of Toejam and Earl. The premise of the game was that the characters of Toejam and Earl, being alien rappers who accidentally crashed their spaceship on Earth, on how to collect pieces of the broken craft to reassemble it and to leave the planet. At the time, the game was considered highly original, and the concept of Toejam and Earl's characters represented the late 1980s and early 1990s in United States popular culture. The game wasn't received well by gamers when originally released, and only became a popular game for Sega later on, but once the game and characters were reacted to positively by gamers and critics, they were highly appreciated and eventually became mascots for Sega within the United States in the early 1990s. But the praise for the game was short-lived, as Toejam and Earl became a franchise for Sega and a sequel was released in 1993, Toejam and Earl in Panagon Funkotron, once again for the Mega Drive. Upon its release, the game had an extraordinary amount of criticisms due to the sharp change in direction for the franchise, as well as gamers complaining about the changes with the game's dynamics from the original game to this sequel. But the game was a financial success, and the criticisms among the changes from the game were well-known news in the video game community for the mid-1990s. Theories at the time complained that Toejam and Earl Productions changed key details of the game on purpose under pressure from Sega to make the series more like a platforming-based game, which were common and arguably popular throughout the 1990s. It's now considered to be one of the first examples of a successful video game turned into a franchise that changed due to external or internal pressures from a developer to conform it to what they might have considered to be that of a good game, against the wishes of the player base or video game community. The changes to the characters as well as the franchise were so controversial that even though the game was a success, a third game wasn't made at the time, due in part to the massive amounts of negative reputations that the franchise later acquired. Due to the poor reception within the United States to the Sega Saturn, the Toejam and Earl franchise, which though divisive, were majorly important for Sega at the time. Due to Sega's collapse as a pillar of the gaming industry, the premise of a third Toejam and Earl game were devised, but never implemented for both the Nintendo 64 and Sega Dreamcast. But the third Toejam and Earl game would eventually be developed but for the Microsoft Xbox, being that of Toejam and Earl 3, Mission to Earth, developed and released in 2002. The negative feedback from the previous game nearly a decade prior once again affected public perceptions of the game. Although some details of the game were praised, the very notion of a Toejam and Earl game, as well as the outdated characters of Toejam and Earl, led to the cancellation of the franchise. In 2019, a period of 17 years later, Toejam and Earl Back in the Groove was developed in part by former designers from the now defunct Toejam and Earl Productions. The game was considered that of a reboot for the franchise, while keeping details from all previous games that gamers and critics preferred or features that these groups of players as well as critics enjoyed. But much like the third game, the premise and concept of Toejam and Earl were outdated from the early 1990s, in which they were so well respected, but in the time since, it seemed redundant. Gamers and critics now speculate that if the Toejam and Earl franchise continues or goes through further reboots, that the original version of the characters on premise of the games were truly the product of the times that they were released in. Sometimes a character can be forgotten because they were originally revolutionary, but simple mistakes destroy their reputation